Hello and welcome. This audio recording is designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and we'll go over a question which may be found on Part C of Paper 1. You may find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision. That's okay too. Many of you will be familiar with what us history teachers call PEE. That is to say, in every paragraph of your answer, you make a point, back it up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotation, people, places and events, and then explain it. Phrases such as "this shows" or "this suggests" are helpful in achieving this, and better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation. We call this PE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So in this response, we will use the PEE formula, and we will offer a 6-part comprehensive scope. Today's question is, what was the nature of Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq? Okay, let's get started. Point 1. Purges and terror. Evidence to support this includes: once Saddam had displaced Bakr from the presidency, he immediately set out to deal with those who questioned his transition to power. One obvious target was Mashhadi, the RCC's Secretary General, who had demanded a vote on the validity of the process. Mashhadi was relieved of his duties and accused of being part of a plot to overthrow the Ba'athist regime. On the 22nd of July 1979, Saddam met with a conference of senior Ba'ath Party members. Mashhadi was brought to this meeting, where he delivered a detailed but fabricated confession of his crimes against the state, and this was followed by the naming of 66 alleged co-conspirators, who were then led out of the hall one by one. One of the accused was Adnan Hussein al-Hamdani, a former close friend of Saddam's, who had only just been appointed Deputy Prime Minister and head of the President's office. A special court was set up to try the 66 accused, of whom 55 were found guilty. 22 were sentenced to death and 33 received prison sentences. The purges and terror continued beyond this high-profile event, as Saddam sought to establish his unquestioned mastery over the party and the army. Hundreds of party members and military officers were purged, many of whom were executed. False accusations, arrests, torture and summary trials, followed by lengthy prison sentences or executions, became a regular feature of Saddam's Iraq. And so, in answering the question, you may wish to explain this point by arguing that one way that Saddam ruled was through the terror and the use of purges. Point 2. Waging war on his own people. Evidence to support this includes: one of Saddam's aims after becoming president was to unify the state of Iraq. This was a major challenge, since the Kurds, who made up 20% of the population in the oil-rich north of the country, wanted independence, while the Shiites, 60% of the population in the central and southern parts of the country, were generally hostile to the Sunni-dominated regime. Previous governments had dealt with this problem using a mixture of diplomacy and force. These were Saddam's tactics too, except he was also prepared to use methods of exceptional brutality and ruthlessness. His campaign against the Kurds was at its most ferocious between 1987 and 1988, and again in 1991. During these engagements, Saddam destroyed half of Kurdistan's villages and towns, killed thousands of Kurds using mustard gas and cyanide, and displaced more than 1 million people. Many fled to Iran or Turkey, while others were housed in concentration camps located in the Iraqi desert. One of the most appalling attacks took place against the town of Halabja in March 1988. Iraqi planes sprayed poison gas over the area, killing 5,000 men, women and children, while inflicting injuries on another 10,000. Saddam took action against the Shiites in 1991 with similar levels of brutality. After the outbreak of revolts, which started in Basra and then spread to the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, the Republican Guard stormed into the rebel strongholds, carrying out arrests and issuing summary executions. Civilians were roped to the front of tanks to act as human shields, while women and children were shot on sight. In the same year, the Marsh Arabs of southeast Iraq came under attack. Saddam had been determined to construct a new waterway in the region, which involved destroying the marshes and displacing a group whose culture stretched back centuries. Some of the Marsh Arabs moved voluntarily, some were the victims of chemical weapon attacks, while others starved to death once their food source had been destroyed. The population of Marsh Arabs dropped from 250,000 to just 30,000. In January 2007, a British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, reported, quote, "Opponents were exterminated. One wavering minister was shot dead during a cabinet meeting. Those spared a firing squad were subjected to videos showing the execution of their friends. Among the forms of torture common in Baghdad's military prisons were the amputation of sexual organs, the hammering of nails into the body, and the dissolving of limbs in vats of acid. Even his closest relations were not safe. In 1996, Saddam had 2 of his sons-in-law killed for defecting to Jordan, having lured them back to Iraq with a false pardon." Unquote. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that one way that Saddam ruled was by waging war on his own people in order to try and unify the state of Iraq. Point 3. Personality cult. Evidence to support this includes: Saddam realised that his dictatorship was unlikely to survive in the long term if it was based solely upon terror. He needed to cultivate popularity and make the Iraqi people love him and adore him. With this in mind, he set about projecting an image of himself as an all-powerful, father-style leader of the nation. Saddam enjoyed fishing and gardening, and people were made aware of this. A permanent exhibition about Saddam was established in Baghdad. His life story regularly featured in newspapers and magazines, and an autobiographical film about his early life called The Long Days was produced by the Iraqi Ministry of Information. Press, radio and TV made constant attempts to glorify Saddam's achievements, while picture portraits of him adorned street corners and decorated party and government offices. By the early 1980s, some 200 songs had been written in praise of Saddam Hussein, and the evening television news would begin with a Saddam song. One of Saddam's favourite routines was to visit ordinary Iraqi homes and villages in disguise in order to discover what people were really thinking about him. His hosts would often pretend not to recognise him and then express delight when he eventually revealed himself. In order to attend as many functions as possible, he resorted to the policy of using body doubles or lookalikes. These men were given months of training during which they studied videos of Saddam's posture, oratory and public appearances. Images of Saddam sprang up everywhere, and streets and squares were named after him. Statues, murals and paintings were commissioned to ensure that no one could remain in ignorance for long as to who their leader was. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that Saddam cultivated a personality cult in order to help him rule Iraq. Point 4. Modernisation. Evidence to support this includes: With the nationalisation of the Iraqi oil industry in 1972, oil revenues increased dramatically from $476 million in 1968 to $26 billion in 1980. This in turn led to a massive improvement in the nation's finances, providing the resources to carry out an extensive modernisation programme of both the economy and social facilities and institutions. This newfound wealth was also used to fund wage rises, tax cuts and subsidies for basic foodstuffs. Modernisation was a key way by which Saddam built up his support base among the Iraqi people. Benefits included extension of electrification. Even remote villages had electricity, and poor families were sometimes gifted TVs and refrigerators. Heavy industry, often using foreign technicians and experts. Steel, petrochemicals and coal all developed. Massive new complexes were constructed at Al Zubair and Basra. Railroads and oil pipelines were set up in Syria and Turkey, leading and linking to Iraq. A new radio and TV network was established, and there were also social improvements, with major building programs of schools, houses and hospitals. School and university enrolment increased, and there was a major campaign to end adult illiteracy. Hospital treatment was made free. And so, in explaining our fourth point, you may wish to argue that modernisation, which came about as a result of the nationalisation of the Iraqi oil industry, helped Saddam to rule Iraq. Point 5. Military organisation. Evidence to support this includes the same oil revenues that helped Saddam to introduce a program of modernisation also helped him to convert Iraq into a major military power. The major supplier of conventional arms to Iraq was Soviet Russia, followed by France. But arms imports also arrived from most of the major European states, together with Yugoslavia and Brazil. With these contacts, Saddam was able to purchase tanks, bombers, helicopters, transport aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, artillery and electronic equipment. His army increased from 10 to 12 divisions. He also wished to build up an arsenal of non-conventional weapons, chemical, biological and nuclear. By July 1979, he had constructed his first chemical warfare plant near Akashat. During the 1980s, with the help of various foreign companies, he was producing significant quantities of distilled mustard, a blister agent, together with Tabun and VX, both of which attack the human nervous system. The biological weapons industry increased in capacity and began producing agents such as anthrax, typhoid and cholera. Saddam's nuclear weapons program was less successful though. As a preliminary step, he purchased the Osirak research reactor from France in 1976, but the Israelis destroyed it in a preemptive bombing raid in June 1981. And further attempts to develop a nuclear capacity were frustrated by the Western Allies' bombing raids during the Gulf War in 1990. And so, in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that his enhanced military organisation helped him to rule the state of Iraq. And so too, point 6, our final point, totalitarianism. Evidence to support this includes Saddam aspired to and ultimately achieved absolute power in Iraq. He ruled the country with a group of trusted party associates and family relatives. Saddam and the Ba'ath Party controlled virtually every aspect of life, social, economic, political and military. Young school children were introduced to party ideas and taught to worship their glorious leader. Similar brainwashing took place through various Ba'ath Party youth organisations. Censorship and a tightly controlled communications media meant that adult Iraqis were unlikely to hear or read any views that were critical about the regime. For example, it was a capital offence to criticise government policy or to join an opposition party. Special courts run by the President's office delivered verdicts of which Saddam would have approved. While the economy was a mixture of state-owned and privately run enterprises, all production was geared to the needs of the state. And membership of the Ba'ath Party was essential for a public career in the army and civil service, or for admission to a university or college of higher education. And so in explaining our final point, you may wish to argue that totalitarianism was a key aspect of Saddam's rule of Iraq. So, in answering the question, what was the nature of Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq, we have given a 6-point scope. Purges and terror, waging war on his own people, personality cult, modernization, military organization, and totalitarianism. Okay, now it's time for our clever conclusion. In answering the question, what was the nature of Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq, we need to remember that Saddam ruled as a dictator after coming to power in 1979. Not only was he president of Iraq, but his positions included those of chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Prime Minister, and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He consciously modelled his regime on that of his political hero, Joseph Stalin. Saddam was a keen reader of Stalin biographies and carefully studied his techniques of government, and there are striking similarities between many aspects of the two men. And so, in controlling Iraq, Saddam's rule was a mixture of totalitarian and dictatorial methods coupled with a program of effective modernization. Okay, thank you very much for listening. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.